Brandon had just finished mending the fence along the eastern side of his farm when he spotted a black SUV creeping up his gravel driveway. The dust cloud behind it swirled in the late afternoon sun, and he already had a bad feeling. He wiped the sweat from his forehead and leaned against the wooden post, waiting. The car rolled to a stop, and out stepped Meredith Lawson, the HOA president from the neighboring subdivision. She was dressed in a crisp blazer and heels, looking completely out of place against the backdrop of open fields and grazing cattle. Brandon barely contained a groan. "Mr. Carter," she said, folding her arms as she glanced around. "We need to talk." Brandon didn't correct her on his last name, he just waited. "This property," she continued, gesturing around, "falls under the jurisdiction of the Maplewood Homeowners Association." Brandon raised an eyebrow. "No, it doesn't." Meredith pursed her lips, as if she had already anticipated his resistance. "Maplewood has expanded. The new development includes several lots bordering your land, and as such, the HOA has a vested interest in maintaining the aesthetic and safety standards of the community." Brandon chuckled. "This is a working farm. I'm not part of any HOA." Her expression hardened. "That's where you're mistaken. According to our recent annexation," Brandon cut her off with a shake of his head. "You don't have the authority to annex private property. This farm has been in my family for 3 generations. It's not some cookie-cutter subdivision lot." Meredith's nostrils flared. "I have the paperwork." "Then take it to court," Brandon said, already turning back toward the fence. "Until a judge tells me otherwise, this land is mine, and I don't answer to the HOA." Meredith's heels crunched against the gravel as she stepped closer. "You're making this difficult, Mr. Carter." "Good," he said over his shoulder. She inhaled sharply, clearly not used to being dismissed. "I'll be back," she warned before storming back to her SUV. Brandon watched her drive off, shaking his head. He had a feeling this wasn't over. Brandon stood by the fence post long after Meredith's SUV disappeared down the road, the dust settling in the evening light. He wasn't the kind of man to get rattled easily, but something about the way she waltzed in here, acting like she had authority over his land, set his teeth on edge. He had no doubt she'd be back, and next time she'd come armed with more than just empty threats. He grabbed his work gloves from the fence post and headed toward the barn. His cattle needed feeding, and he had no intention of letting some HOA bureaucrat disrupt his routine. As he walked, he made a mental note to check his property records first thing in the morning. He knew his land wasn't part of any HOA, but he wanted to be absolutely certain before this turned into a bigger fight. Inside the barn, the scent of hay and livestock filled the air as he scooped a bucket of feed. His dog, Rusty, trotted up beside him, tail wagging, completely oblivious to the nonsense that had just unfolded outside. If only life could be as simple as Rusty made it look. The next morning, Brandon drove into town and stopped by the county clerk's office. He was on a first-name basis with most of the folks working there, and it didn't take long for him to get the documents he needed. As expected, his farm was completely independent of Maplewood's HOA. There were no easements, no annexations, nothing that gave them any say over his land. Feeling justified, he headed back home, but as he turned onto his property's long driveway, he spotted something that made his blood boil. A group of workers in reflective vests were setting up wooden stakes along the edge of his fence line. A white HOA-branded truck was parked nearby, and standing beside it, clipboard in hand, was Meredith. Brandon pulled up and stepped out of his truck, his boots crunching against the gravel. The workers glanced at him uneasily, but Meredith remained unfazed. She greeted him with the kind of forced politeness that barely masked her impatience. She explained that the stakes marked the boundary where a new walking path would be installed. According to her, it was part of Maplewood's effort to create a seamless transition between the neighborhood and the surrounding rural charm. Brandon folded his arms, letting a long silence stretch between them before asking one simple question: who gave her permission? Meredith's confident expression faltered for a split second before she rattled off a vague answer about community expansion and progress. Brandon wasn't interested in her flowery language. He walked over to the nearest stake, yanked it out of the ground, and tossed it aside. The workers immediately froze, unsure of what to do. Meredith's face turned red with frustration, and she launched into a lecture about civility and cooperation. Brandon cut her off. He pulled out the documents he had collected from the county clerk's office and held them up. He made it clear that his farm was not, and never would be, part of the HOA. Whatever plans she had for expansion, they ended at his property line. Meredith attempted to argue, but Brandon wasn't having it. He ordered the workers off his land and made it clear that if anyone set foot on his property again without his permission, he'd involve law enforcement. The workers didn't need to be told twice. They packed up their equipment and drove off, leaving Meredith standing alone, her jaw clenched in frustration. She accused him of being unreasonable, of standing in the way of progress. Brandon simply reminded her that progress didn't happen by trespassing on someone else's land. With nothing left to say, Meredith stormed off, but something told Brandon this wasn't over. As he watched her drive away, he knew one thing for certain: next time, she'd come back swinging. Brandon spent the next few days reinforcing his property lines. He installed new private property no trespassing signs along the fences and double-checked his security cameras to ensure they covered every possible entry point. The last thing he needed was Meredith sending another crew onto his land, thinking she could push her agenda through sheer persistence. He had dealt with stubborn people before, but something about Meredith made his instincts scream that she wasn't going to let this go. Most people backed down when presented with hard facts, but HOA presidents like her thrived on control. She had probably never been told no in a way that actually stuck, and that made her dangerous. Brandon was proven right when, on a quiet Thursday morning, he spotted a small group of Maplewood residents gathered just outside his fence line. They weren't construction workers this time; these were homeowners, dressed in casual clothes, murmuring among themselves as they traced the property boundary with interested glances. And right in the middle of them stood Meredith, speaking with practiced authority as if she were giving a guided tour. Brandon left his truck where it was and walked toward the fence, leaning against one of the posts as he observed them. Meredith noticed him almost immediately, her expression tightening before she plastered on a diplomatic smile. She raised her voice, ensuring he could hear her as she addressed the group. She spoke about community integration and shared resources, emphasizing how Maplewood's expansion was meant to benefit everyone, including him. The way she framed it, she almost made it sound like she was doing him a favor by trying to claim a piece of his land. Brandon remained silent as she rattled on, waiting for her to get to the point. When she finally turned to face him directly, she adopted a tone that was meant to sound reasonable but carried an unmistakable edge of condescension. She proposed a compromise. She and the HOA would allow him to keep farming as long as he agreed to certain aesthetic standards that aligned with Maplewood's vision. In exchange, he would grant them a portion of his land along the border to use for their walking path and community gardens. She presented it as a win-win, as if he should be grateful for the opportunity. Brandon didn't bother pretending to consider it. He made it clear in no uncertain terms that there would be no compromise. His land wasn't up for negotiation, and he wasn't about to let an HOA dictate how he ran his farm. The gathered residents shifted uncomfortably, glancing between him and Meredith. Some of them clearly hadn't expected resistance, and a few even looked like they hadn't been informed that this land wasn't actually part of the HOA. Meredith, however, didn't waver. Instead, she doubled down, suggesting that if he refused to cooperate, the HOA might have no choice but to escalate matters. Brandon narrowed his eyes. She wasn't just pushing boundaries anymore, she was outright threatening him. Not one to be intimidated, he leaned forward slightly and calmly pointed out that any further attempts to infringe on his property would be considered trespassing. And if the HOA tried any legal maneuvers, he was more than ready to counter them. He had already spoken to a lawyer and confirmed that the HOA had no jurisdiction here. The shift in Meredith's expression was subtle but telling. She had been banking on him being uninformed, hoping she could pressure him into compliance before he realized she had no actual power over him. Now that she knew he wasn't going to be an easy target, she was struggling to maintain her usual composed demeanor. One of the homeowners hesitated before asking Meredith if she was sure the land was part of the HOA's expansion. Meredith shot the man a sharp look before smoothing over the moment with more vague reassurances. But Brandon could see the cracks forming. Some of these people were beginning to realize they had been misled. Brandon took the opportunity to address them directly, explaining that his farm had never been part of the HOA and never would be. If Meredith had told them otherwise, then they might want to start questioning what else she had misrepresented. The murmurs among the residents grew louder. A few exchanged uneasy glances before quietly slipping away, clearly wanting no part in whatever Meredith was trying to pull. Meredith's jaw tightened, but she quickly masked her frustration. She made one last attempt to salvage her position, claiming that Maplewood's expansion was inevitable and that it would be in his best interest to cooperate before he was forced to comply. Brandon tilted his head slightly, as if considering her words. Then he simply turned around and walked away, dismissing her so completely that she was left standing there, seething in silence. Behind him, he heard a few more residents mumbling among themselves, some clearly realizing that they had been dragged into a situation they wanted no part of. Meredith's power play was beginning to unravel, and she knew it. As he reached his truck, he glanced over his shoulder just in time to see Meredith marching back toward her car with stiff, jerky movements. Whatever she had planned next, he had no doubt it would be even more desperate, and when that time came, he'd be ready. Brandon kept a close eye on his property over the next few days, expecting Meredith to make another move. She had been embarrassed in front of her own HOA members, and people like her didn't take public failure lightly. He knew she would try to regain control, but he wasn't about to let her dictate anything on his land. Early one morning, well before the sun had fully risen, he was in the barn tending to his cattle when a low rumble caught his attention. He stepped outside, wiping his hands on a cloth, and spotted a convoy of vehicles rolling down the dirt road toward his property. His jaw tightened. 2 white HOA pickup trucks were in the lead, followed by a van with a company logo for a landscaping service. Behind them, a few sedans carrying what he assumed were Maplewood board members trailed along, headlights still on in the dim morning light. Brandon closed the barn door behind him and walked toward the main gate where the vehicles were slowing to a stop. He didn't need to wait long before Meredith stepped out of the lead truck, clipboard in hand, wearing an expression that said she fully expected to get her way this time. She barely acknowledged him before gesturing to the landscapers, who immediately started unloading equipment: lawn mowers, hedge trimmers, and even a few saplings. Watching them move like they had already been given permission, Brandon felt his patience snap. He stepped into their path, forcing the nearest worker to halt mid-step. Meredith, clearly annoyed, addressed him in a tone dripping with false politeness. She announced that the HOA had decided to take matters into their own hands since he had refused to cooperate. According to her, the community beautification project would proceed as scheduled, and they would be enhancing the property border to better integrate it into Maplewood's aesthetic. Brandon didn't waste time arguing. He pulled out his phone, snapped a few pictures of the workers on his land, and then made a call to the county sheriff. Meredith's confident expression flickered when she realized what he was doing, but she quickly recovered and attempted to spin the situation. She claimed that he had been given multiple chances to work with the HOA and that they were simply following through with the necessary improvements. Brandon didn't even bother responding. He crossed his arms and waited. The workers hesitated when they saw his lack of concern, some of them exchanging uneasy glances. It was one thing to take orders from the HOA, but another to be caught trespassing on private property. Minutes later, the sound of approaching sirens cut through the morning air. A sheriff's cruiser pulled up, and an officer stepped out, adjusting his belt as he took in the scene. Brandon recognized him Deputy Lane, a no-nonsense type who had dealt with plenty of land disputes in the past. Meredith immediately launched into a rehearsed explanation, painting herself as the one ensuring community standards were upheld. She tried to frame Brandon as an uncooperative neighbor who was standing in the way of progress, but Lane wasn't buying it. He listened, nodded occasionally, and then turned to Brandon for his side of the story. Brandon kept it short. He pointed out that the HOA had no authority over his land, that the workers had been brought in without his consent, and that Meredith had ignored previous warnings to stay off his property. He handed Lane the paperwork proving that his farm was entirely outside the HOA's jurisdiction. Lane took his time reviewing the documents before turning back to Meredith. His tone was calm but firm as he explained that the HOA had no legal grounds to proceed with any modifications to Brandon's property. Furthermore, since they had entered without permission, they were trespassing. Meredith's face darkened as she scrambled for another angle. She tried insisting that the homeowners had voted for this project, that the community had a right to maintain its surroundings. Lane shut her down quickly, reminding her that votes within an HOA didn't extend beyond its legally defined borders. With no more room to argue, Meredith was forced to order her workers to pack up. The landscapers wasted no time loading their equipment back into the van. Some of the HOA board members looked uneasy, clearly realizing that this was not going to end in their favor. Lane wasn't done. He issued a formal warning for trespassing, and made it clear that if anyone from the HOA stepped onto Brandon's land again without his explicit permission, there would be legal consequences. Meredith tried to protest, but Lane gave her a hard stare that made it clear there was no room for negotiation. As the vehicles pulled away, Brandon watched Meredith's rigid posture and the way her hands clenched around her clipboard. She was furious, but she couldn't do anything about it. Once the last car disappeared down the road, Brandon let out a slow breath and turned back toward the barn. He had won this round, but he had a feeling Meredith wasn't finished yet. If she couldn't use legal means to get what she wanted, she might try something even more underhanded. That was fine. He'd be ready. Brandon carried on with his usual routine, keeping a watchful eye on his property for any signs of renewed interference. He had dealt with stubborn bureaucrats before, but Meredith was proving to be relentless. The fact that she had already been warned by law enforcement should have been enough to deter her. Instead, he suspected she was simply regrouping, looking for another way to impose her will. His instincts were confirmed a few days later when he received an official-looking envelope in the mail. The HOA's logo was stamped on the front, making it clear who had sent it. He opened it with little expectation of anything worthwhile inside. As soon as he skimmed the contents, his jaw tightened. The letter was a formal notice of violation, listing supposed infractions that his farm was allegedly committing against Maplewood's community standards. The absurdity of it made him shake his head. The document accused him of everything from failing to maintain proper landscaping to allowing disruptive agricultural operations within a residential adjacent zone. It even included a fine, a ridiculous sum that the HOA was demanding he pay for being non-compliant. Brandon tossed the letter onto the kitchen table and exhaled slowly. This wasn't just an overreach, it was a blatant attempt at intimidation. Meredith had moved past trying to persuade him, and had now shifted to fabricating penalties in hopes of bullying him into submission. Rather than reacting immediately, he decided to handle this on his own terms. He gathered the letter, along with the property records he had already obtained, and made a trip into town. His first stop was the county clerk's office, where he confirmed once again that there were no legal zoning restrictions on his farm that could justify the HOA's claims. His land had always been designated for agricultural use, and nothing had changed. His next stop was the sheriff's office. Deputy Lane wasn't in, but another deputy assured him that the HOA had no authority to issue fines outside their jurisdiction. The deputy chuckled as he skimmed the letter, shaking his head at the audacity of it. He advised Brandon to ignore it and let them know if the HOA attempted to escalate matters further. Brandon thanked him and left, but he had no intention of simply ignoring it. Meredith had made a mistake by putting her threats in writing. That gave him leverage. Instead of responding directly to the HOA, he decided to bring the matter to the attention of someone with real influence, the county commissioner. He scheduled a meeting and presented the letter, along with his property documents, to one of the commissioner's aides. The aide took one look at the supposed fine and frowned. It didn't take long for them to recognize the blatant overreach. By the time Brandon left the office, he had assurances that the county would be reviewing Maplewood's recent actions, particularly their attempts to claim authority beyond their legal boundaries. If Meredith thought she could strong-arm him through official-looking paperwork, she was about to learn the hard way that he wasn't the type to roll over. A few days later, he got his confirmation. Meredith showed up again, this time without her usual entourage. She parked her SUV just outside his gate and sat there for a long moment before stepping out. There was something different about her this time, less of the smug confidence she usually carried. Instead, she looked tense, almost wary. Brandon didn't invite her in. He simply leaned against the fence and waited for her to speak. She started with what sounded like an attempt at diplomacy. She claimed that the HOA had only been trying to ensure a harmonious transition between Maplewood and the surrounding properties. She insisted that the notice he had received wasn't meant to be hostile, but rather a way to open a conversation about how they could work together. Brandon let her talk, but he didn't buy a word of it. When she finally paused, he pulled out a copy of the letter and held it up. He pointed out the fine, the fabricated violations, and the fact that she had no legal grounds to enforce any of it. Then he told her exactly what he had done, how he had taken the matter to the county, and how they were now looking into Maplewood's actions. The moment he mentioned the county commissioner's office, Meredith's expression faltered. She tried to recover, but it was clear that she hadn't expected him to escalate things beyond their usual back and forth. She attempted to backpedal, claiming that there must have been a misunderstanding, that the letter had perhaps been issued prematurely. Brandon cut her off. He made it clear that if she or anyone from the HOA attempted another stunt like this, he would take legal action. Meredith looked like she wanted to argue, but for once, she held her tongue. Without another word, she turned and walked back to her SUV. Brandon watched her go, knowing that this wasn't over. But for the first time, he saw something in her that he hadn't before: hesitation. She was starting to realize that she had picked the wrong person to intimidate, and if she tried again, he would be ready to shut her down even harder. Brandon had expected Meredith to pull back after her last failed attempt, but he should have known better. If anything, people like her didn't know how to back down, they just found sneakier ways to push forward. That suspicion was confirmed when he noticed unfamiliar cars slowing down near the property line over the next few days. Some even stopped for a few minutes, their occupants scanning the farm like they were surveying potential real estate. It didn't take a genius to figure out that Meredith was still trying to push her expansion plans, just in a quieter way. Brandon wasn't about to play defense forever. If she was going to keep testing his patience, then he was going to make sure her next move cost her. He spent an evening reviewing everything he had gathered so far: the trespassing attempts, the illegal fine notice, and the bogus claims about annexation. Then, he made a few calls to some people who actually had authority over land disputes: a real estate attorney and a local investigative journalist who had exposed shady HOA dealings in the past. The lawyer confirmed what Brandon already knew: the HOA had no claim, and the fake fine was borderline fraud. But it was the journalist, Lisa McGregor, who was particularly interested in the story. She had covered similar HOA abuses before, and she recognized Meredith's tactics immediately. A few days later, Lisa showed up at the farm to get first-hand details. Brandon walked her along the property line, pointing out the spots where Meredith had sent workers and where she had tried to claim land for her walking path. He handed over copies of the fake violation letter and the county records proving his farm was independent. Lisa was practically giddy. She had seen HOA overreach before, but this was brazen even by their standards. She promised to run the story and reach out to other homeowners in Maplewood to see if they had been bullied in similar ways. That was exactly what Brandon had been hoping for. Meredith thrived on controlling people through intimidation, but nothing unraveled that power faster than exposure. The article dropped a week later. It was a brutal takedown of Meredith's tactics, detailing every attempt she had made to seize control of Brandon's farm. It even included a few anonymous quotes from Maplewood residents who had been pressured into supporting her expansion plans under false pretenses. The fallout was immediate. Maplewood's HOA board was flooded with angry emails from homeowners who had no idea what was going on. Some demanded to know why their fees were being used to wage an unwinnable battle against a private farm. Others questioned Meredith's leadership altogether. Then came the county's response. With the article shining a light on the situation, officials could no longer ignore it. They sent a formal notice to the HOA, warning that any further attempts to assert control over Brandon's land could result in legal action. Brandon expected Meredith to come storming back, but instead she went quiet. Too quiet. That silence lasted for almost a month, and for a while it seemed like the fight might finally be over. But then, in the middle of a late afternoon, a black luxury sedan pulled up in front of his gate. Brandon didn't recognize the man who stepped out, but everything about him screamed lawyer. The man introduced himself as Richard Calloway, legal representation for the Maplewood HOA. He wasted no time getting to the point. He claimed that Meredith had been unfairly targeted, that the article had damaged her reputation, and that the HOA was now considering legal action against Brandon for defamation and obstruction of community development. Brandon barely stopped himself from laughing. He had expected Meredith to try something desperate, but this was pathetic. He let Calloway ramble for a few minutes before casually mentioning that he had his own legal counsel. Then, in an almost bored tone, he pointed out that the HOA had no legal claim to his land, that Meredith had been caught trespassing, and that any lawsuit would only further expose her misconduct. The lawyer hesitated, clearly realizing he had overplayed his hand. He attempted to pivot, suggesting that perhaps a mutual resolution could be reached if Brandon was willing to reconsider allowing Maplewood access to part of his land. Brandon didn't even let him finish. He simply shook his head and told Calloway that the next time the HOA tried anything, he wouldn't just expose them, he would sue them for harassment. The lawyer left without another word. A few days later, Meredith officially stepped down as HOA president. The announcement came quietly, buried in a Maplewood newsletter, but Brandon knew it wasn't voluntary. The article had cracked her facade, and the failed legal threat had shattered it completely. Whatever power she had once held over the community was gone, and without that power, she had no reason to stay. Brandon never saw her again after that. The road near his farm went back to being quiet, the unwanted visitors disappeared, and Maplewood's new HOA president sent a carefully worded letter officially acknowledging that his land was not, and never would be, part of their jurisdiction. Brandon framed that letter and hung it in his barn, a reminder that some fights were worth standing your ground for.